Welcome to Videocast 6 of the Musicuentos Black Box Podcast, co-sponsored by musicuentos.com and Indwelling Language. This episode is developed and presented by me, Justin Slocum Bailey, learner, teacher, teacher-trainer, and operator of indwellinglanguage.com. The topic of this episode is The Inescapable Case for Extensive Reading by Rob Waring of Notre Dame Seishin University in Japan. In addition to scholarship, Waring has produced many graded readers and other resources for learners of English. In this chapter, Waring uses both linguistic and statistical arguments to show that attempting to teach or learn a language without extensive reading is tremendously inefficient and indeed holds learners back. Extensive reading is reading large amounts of text that are easy for the reader to understand, as opposed to intensive reading, which is reading a low volume of difficult text. Waring's overall argument is straightforward. The number of words and word relationships that a learner needs to have internalized in order to understand native speech and text is huge. Textbooks and teachers cannot hope, and don't even try, to teach explicitly anything close to the needed number of words and word relationships, let alone nuances of meaning and usage in different contexts. The most efficient way for learners to meet enough instances of words and to develop an overall sense of a language is through extensive reading. You can check the statistical factors for yourself in the article, but let's look at some examples to illustrate Waring's points, as well as the ideal conditions for acquiring language through extensive reading. Not only do learners need to know a large number of words, Waring says one needs to have learned about 5,000 word families in order to read native text extensively, but, quote, to really know a word well, learners need to know not only meanings and spellings, but the nuances of its meanings, its register, whether it is more commonly used for speaking or writing, which discourse categories it is usually found in, as well as its collocations and colligations among many other things, end quote. This is far too much to teach or learn intentionally for every word. Also, textbooks tend only to introduce the language by means of samples, and even if they have lots of samples, they don't provide anything like the volume of input necessary for acquisition. Thus, even for words and collocations that textbooks or teachers do teach explicitly, learners are dependent on extensive reading and listening for sufficient input. So what makes a text suitable for extensive reading? The studies Waring cites suggest that, unless about 98% of the words in a text are already known, the chances of acquiring the unknown vocabulary are low, both because of the noise in the text, and because reading speed is reduced to the degree that, quote, learners will not be able to meet enough language input to meet and pick up new words or collocations from context, end quote. For this reason, Waring calls for the provision of a wide array of reading and listening materials, including adapted and graded content for novice and intermediate learners. Near the end of the chapter, Waring connects extensive reading with learners' production of the language. To teachers who ask, why can't my learners speak? They've been learning English for years now. I teach them things, but they just don't use them. It's so frustrating. Waring gives this answer, mincing no words. Quote, learners will only speak when they are ready to. That is, they will speak once they feel comfortable enough using the language feature or word. But where does this comfort come from? It comes from experience with the language. The more times they meet a word, a phrase, a grammatical feature, the more chance it has to enter their comfort zone, and the greater chance there is for it to become available for production. Bluntly stated, language programs that do not have an extensive reading or graded reading component of massive, comprehensible, sustained, silent, individualized language practice will hold back their learners, end quote. In case that's not strong enough, Waring goes on, quote, it is a fundamental mistake to consider sustained silent reading as supplemental or optional. Extensive reading, or listening, is the only way in which learners can get access to language at their own comfort level, read something they want to read, at the pace they feel comfortable with, which will allow them to meet the language enough times to pick up a sense of how the language fits together and to consolidate what they know. It is impossible for teachers to teach a sense of language. We do not have time, and it is not our job. It is the learner's job to get that sense for themselves. This depth of knowledge of language must, and can only, be acquired through constant, massive exposure. End quote. Wow. Let me offer a few questions for reflection and application. 1. Do you put pressure on yourself to provide students with a complete sense of the language? You cannot hope to provide that sense yourself. You can provide or direct them to texts and other content that, in large quantities and over time, help students internalize the language. 2. What access do your students have to reading and listening material in and out of class that is interesting to them and is 98% comprehensible to them? 3. What procedures do you have in place to make sure students get the constant, massive exposure they need if they are to develop their own sense of the language? 4. What changes might you need to make or request in your curriculum, budget, or expectations in order to take seriously the need for extensive reading and listening? For more of Waring's comments on the relationship between extensive reading and textbooks, the relationship between intentional and incidental learning, and the use of texts written for native speakers, please check out the full article. This has been a presentation of the Musicuentos Black Box Podcast, a collection of media resources intended to form an easy-to-access, easy-to-understand bridge between second language acquisition research and teacher practice in the world language classroom. For more information about the Musicuentos Black Box Podcast collection of resources, including ways you can help keep this resource available to teachers everywhere, visit musicuentos.com/blackbox.